You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 18th of December 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up.
Europe is ready to do its part to support Syria at this critical juncture. Our top diplomat returns to Damascus.
How may we help? The international community offers diplomatic help to the new authorities in Syria. Will they be useful or even welcome? Also coming up, Russia vows to take revenge for the killing of a senior general in a Moscow street. We'll ask not if, but when and how this will happen. Plus,
when the world reached this level of violence, people want to have access to peaceful piece of content.
We celebrate the 80th birthday of France's flagship newspaper Le Monde. Its CEO will explain to us what drives its agenda today. Plus the newspapers and the transport news as well. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. The US State Department has expressed optimism at the chances of a ceasefire and hostage deal between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. China's President Xi Jinping arrives in Macau today to mark a quarter century of Beijing's rule over the former Portuguese territory. And Luigi Mangione, the man suspected of shooting the healthcare boss Brian Thompson in New York, has been indicted for murder and also faces one charge related to terror. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, France has raised its flag at its embassy in Damascus for the first time in 12 years. European Union officials are preparing to engage with the new administration in Syria, and Britain has sent a team to meet Ahmed al-Sharaa, the leader of the new authorities in Damascus. The message from the international community seems that between 2011 and last week, the world turned its back on Syria's despotic leader Bashar al-Assad, but never on its people. However, the UN Special Envoy to Syria has urged that unless the country receives urgent support, it could be plunged back into conflict. Geir Pedersen highlighted recent clashes between Turkish-backed groups and Kurdish forces in the northeast, where a US-brokered ceasefire has been extended. Well, to tell us more about this complicated path that needs to be navigated, I'm joined now by Daniela Pelled, Managing Editor of the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, a regular voice here on Monocle Radio. A very good morning to you, Daniela.
Good morning.
There is a big rush to go now from the international community, isn't it? We heard from Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, saying we're going back to Damascus.
Steady on. I mean, these are early. This is a rush, but we're not returning diplomats. We're not recognising the new rulers. But there is certainly a pressure of time, not least the inauguration of Donald Trump in just a few weeks. He's made it very clear from the beginning that this was not something that America wanted to get involved with. That Syria was other people's problems, but he is very capricious, and it's very hard to see how he might react. We're seeing this as well with Israel and the Palestinians, that there is a rush to push forward this Gaza truce. Although no one could accuse him of being anything but pro-Israel, Trump has made it clear that he wants it sorted. So, yeah, I think there's a time pressure. Otherwise, I think this would be happening in a much slower way. But it signals great pragmatism from European leaders, which I think in a way is encouraging.
In what way does it signal pragmatism as well as being on a clock?
Well, look, this is an unprecedented situation here, the rapid fall of Assad. But we have situations where we see territories ruled by Islamist and extremist groups. And, for instance, the international community was presented with a conundrum in Afghanistan, for instance. How do you provide services or aid to the citizens while not dealing with the Taliban? And that has been extraordinarily difficult. and civilians in general suffer. Nothing is going to. All the contexts are completely different, but there are enough similarities, I think, for statecraft to learn from them. This is really a time for pragmatism. And so far as well, Ahmed al-Sharaa, the head of HTS, has made all the right noises. He's talked about disbanding the factions. He's been made efforts to speak in a very inclusive manner. Many Syrians, for a start, may not trust him or his forces, but they're thankful and they want to see where this will go.
So who is the international community actually going and talking to as they, we had Britain sending a team to meet Ahmed al-Sharaa a little earlier this week, but is there even yet a national administration or what is there when these international figures arrive?
First of all, there's no way that HTS can automatically replace the administration of a state with its own people. They've been running Idlib for a while, but this is different. In any case, Syria has been, to put it mildly, a basket case in recent years. It was already one of the most corrupt countries in the world. I think, according to Transparency International last year, it's fallen to really, really near the bottom of the index. State services don't work. The bureaucracy doesn't work. Infrastructure doesn't work. So you can't just tear it up and start again. Also, it's clear that economic restructuring will be key to any recovery. The economy collapsed. Over half of Syrians live in poverty. GDP last year was just 9 billion, which is really very little for a country that size. And overhanging all of this is another pragmatic issue, which are the refugees. There are nearly 5 million Syrians who fled the country during the war. 7 million are displaced within Syria. The issue of refugees is really important. They have had, put it bluntly, a destabilizing effect on other countries in the region. And other countries also under pressure. Never mind European countries. There is already a push for the refugees to return. Not all will return, but asylum applications have been paused. And I think it's clearly a strategic interest for the international community that refugees will return from the neighbouring countries and perhaps even from further afield as well. And
how much, Daniela, is this refugee issue the driving force between this sort of push by the international community? Or is there wider issues as well, and also the question of influence?
Yeah, influence is also important. France is in a good position because it cut ties with Assad early on in the revolution, and it had made no moves to normalise ties with the Assad regime. It also has this link as the former sort of colonial powers that's from the time of the French Mandate. Europe seems to be having almost collective policy here, dealing as pragmatists, but certainly we are going to see all the countries regionally and further afield jockeying for position here. It also suits some powers supporting the current status quo, because of course this is really bad for Iran and Russia. So there's a huge level of pragmatism, and I think within all this there is still a hope, from speaking to Syrians and others, that actually this might not be too bad. This isn't going to be a glorious democracy in 5 minutes, but this is the start of a slow and steady improvement of life for the Syrian people, because this crisis didn't start 2 weeks ago. This has been something that's been boiling for years now.
That's something that you raised, the idea that perhaps this might not be as bad as people could expect it to be. But when we hear Geir Pedersen, who's the UN Special Envoy to Syria, saying that unless the country receives urgent support, it could be plunged back into conflict. He was talking about clashes between Turkish-backed groups in the northeast of the country and Kurdish forces there as well. There is a sense that the dispute within Syria is already an international one and has been for a while.
I mean, I think it was from right from the beginning, and the international community rather shamefully turned their back on the people of Syria in many ways. But if you're looking at it from a practical way, a practical and pragmatic way, economic recovery is crucial for Syria to be stable. You need jobs, you need legal framework, you need investment, infrastructure rebuilding, you need peace, you need public order. All these are really quite dull aspects of statehood. And those are things that the international community can support, and frankly will have to support unless Syria just descends into further violence.
And how much of a lesson is this to the international community, that the fact that people are talking to HTS is the fact that things change, positions change, and groups that were once proscribed now have to be dealt with in a very open and, as you have mentioned, pragmatic manner?
Well, absolutely. I mean, these are very initial talks. Again, this is just being purely practical. HTS, like many other groups in the Syrian war, committed atrocities and human rights abuses. Although the regime was the prime player when it comes to death and torture, the other groups also participated. So when you talk about, for instance, transitional justice, how can a process like that be supported? We're a long way from that. And I think what the international community has learned, if we learn any lessons, is that things need to be stabilized as much as possible right now. The larger power players have, like Iran and Russia, have been pushed out to a huge extent, and now is an opportunity for to have not a glorious pinnacle of human rights democracy in the area, but at least a moment of pause.
Daniela Peled, Managing Editor of the Institute for War and Peace Reporting here in London. Thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. 9:12 a.m. in Moscow, 7:12 a.m. here in London. Now, for Kyiv to successfully target a senior Russian general is a significant scalp for Ukraine in its continued war with Moscow. For Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, chief of Russia's nuclear, biological and chemical protection troops, to be blown up outside a Moscow apartment by a bomb hidden in an electric scooter, well, this is something of a different level altogether. Russia has warned of the inevitable retribution that Ukraine will face. To tell us what that might be, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Stephen Dalziel, Russia analyst and a regular voice here on Monocle Radio. Good morning, Stephen.
Good morning, Emma.
This was not an insignificant bomb, was it? It was enough to blow a big chunk out of a wall. So this was something that was clearly not an amateur job. But what do we know about how this happened?
We still don't know sort of the exact details, except that, quite interestingly, just at the time that Moscow was saying this is outrageous, this was the Ukrainian Secret Service, the Ukrainian Secret Service said this was us. They're quite proud to have been able to do it. I think that the way in which it was planned was quite clever because, as in many cities around the world nowadays, you get what I think are these nuisance of these scooters which are just left all over the pavement, and so they attached the explosive to the handlebars of this scooter. So, no one going out in the morning, or, they might sort of say, oh, someone left one of those things again, but it wouldn't actually look that odd. So, whereas they might, for example, check it underneath a car, whether they're doing that these days, they might have got sloppy on that too. But no one, as far as we know, has used that before. You put the explosive actually on the handlebar of a scooter, put it right next to the entrance to the doorway. But the particularly interesting thing, and the fact that maybe will come out eventually, but the really curious thing we don't know yet is, did they have someone on the other side of the street watching? A video has appeared, which appears to show the moment of explosion. Now, is that someone who, phoned the number, did whatever they had to do to cause the explosion to go off, who then fled? It was it was dark at that time in the morning in Moscow. But this video I saw last night, it's shocking. I mean, you see two men emerge from a building and then there's this explosion. But it just seems the timing had to be so perfect that you think they had to have someone watching, which that will give Moscow, that will have Moscow scared as anything. If they can do that to someone on a street in Moscow, what next? Are they going to take out other individuals?
And the suggestion is, as you said at the beginning of this interview, that the Ukrainian intelligence services claimed responsibility for it. I mean, but to be able to do what they did yesterday suggests that they are very deep in Moscow.
It does indeed. One thing which we thought about all along during the course of the war is one of the problems for Ukraine is that, of course, there can be, and there are indeed, many sleeper agents inside Ukraine who've lived there for years, who are actually Russians, who before the war wouldn't even been, people wouldn't have paid any attention to them. And we know that, information intelligence has been passed back to Russia on certain, Ukrainian troop movements and so on. But of course, it works in reverse. And to be honest, I've never particularly thought about this until this incident, that of course there can be Ukrainians who, because of the previous relationship between Russia and Ukraine and the Soviet Union, who may have been living in Russia and in Moscow for many years, and they can do the exact reverse of what the Ukrainian Russian intelligence has been doing in Ukraine. And this would seem to be an example of that. And
there is a suggestion now, I'm not entirely sure whether the phrase is correct, but there's the issue that the Muscovites and Russia is now very worried about this program of what can be called decapitation, which is when they go around and they pick off the targets that they wish to, and they just take them out one by one.
Well, that's what Russia will be very worried about now. What a backlash might be that people who are of Ukrainian descent, who live in Russia, they may now be worried that they may be called in for questioning or whatever, but there are just too many of them for this to happen too much. So, yes, I would be surprised if this turns out to be an isolated incident, to be honest. I think that having succeeded once, whatever the Russians do to improve their security, it's a sort of tiny operation, as it were, in the sense of you don't need a lot of people involved. They probably won't use a scooter again. Scooters, no doubt, will be taken off the streets of Moscow or monitored much more carefully. But it's the sort of thing. In that sense, it's if I say it's clever, I'm just looking at it from a military point of view. It's clever because it's certainly got Moscow worried and thinking, well, what next, and how do we guard against this? Because that sort of thing is very difficult to guard against.
In addition to that, what does Russia do in terms of its retaliation? It has already said that it will, enact inevitable retribution. Do we know that what form or shape that could take, given what Russia's done in the last couple of years in Ukraine?
Well, there is bound to be something, unfortunately, something perhaps rather big against Ukraine. If we think, recently Putin fired this hypersonic missile, the Oreshnik, against Dnipro. On that occasion, it is nuclear capable, but in fact, it was fired with dummy warheads, and so it didn't even have any explosive. It caused fires because something moving at hypersonic speed that and sends out a number of projectiles that hit things are bound to cause fires. They may well step it up and use the Oreshnik with conventional weaponry, conventional armaments to cause some very serious damage. My one thing which I'm on the side of saying I do not think they're going to go nuclear. I don't think Putin will risk using a single nuclear missile, because if he uses a single nuclear missile, that really ups the ante, and that will bring NATO. That is a red line of NATO's, which he doesn't know that they won't cross. And if he uses one nuclear missile, there could be huge retribution from our side, not just from Ukraine, but from NATO, because you don't do that. So I would doubt he'd go nuclear, but there could be something like a massive strike by a hypersonic missile with conventional warheads. How
much has this damaged the reputation of the Russian authorities from within Russia? I mean, do we know how it's been reported? Because obviously there's going to be the retribution that you talked about, and it will, by all intents and purposes, have a much larger scale in terms of its targeting. But is there a sense that actually there has been some reputational damage inside Russia?
Oh, undoubtedly. It's been reported as, isn't this outrageous? Look what Ukraine has done. They have reported it. And of course, social media picks up on these things very quickly, even if Russian social media is rather limited by the Kremlin. But even so, this will have Muscovites worried, because Muscovites have been living for months and months, probably the last couple of years, really, after the initial shock of the war, of thinking, it's a long way away, it doesn't really affect us. Well, suddenly it's on their back doorstep. It's on their front doorstep in this case, indeed. And that will definitely have people very, very nervous. Certainly for in the next few weeks and months, will something else happen? And if something else does happen, that is really going to get them jittery. And I can't say it would cause a wave of demonstrations against the war, because Russians still get locked up for doing that. But it will make people realise that actually this war is not so far from home. This war is actually involving all Russians.
Stephen Dalziel, Russia analyst, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers. I'm delighted to say that joining me in the studio is Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent, former CNN Europe editor. Good morning, Nina.
Good morning.
A week to go to Christmas. How are you doing?
Holding up.
Excellent. Yeah, carry on.
So's the news agenda. Not letting up, is it?
Not letting up, not at all. And obviously, things are busy. What's the first story you wanted to talk to us about? Because it's a really unusual tale about resources and Poland.
And food before Christmas,
yes.
Yeah. You and I will probably be old enough as journalists to remember the EU's famed butter mountain. Remember that, when they started trying to sort of shore up prices by sort of hoarding butter, allegedly? I never quite figured out whether or not Brussels was indeed made of butter. But the
had
butter
that image,
mountain,
didn't we?
Yeah, we did. And it was very politicised, wasn't it, here in Britain? I suppose the backdrop to Brexit, was built upon not so solid foundations of butter. Hey, anyway, political change in Poland may well be suffering the same fate, because Poland has, as of this week, decided to release, wait for it, drumroll please, its strategic butter reserves.
Excellent.
It's starting to sell off 1,000 tonnes worth of what the FT disappointingly somewhat calls the milk-based spread in bars to try and help with prices that have been soaring in Poland. Now, Poland actually has a bit of a problem with inflation that's bigger than elsewhere in the Eurozone. At 4.7%, it is higher than in other parts of the Eurozone. Remember that Poland is one of those countries that nearly took the euro and then stepped back from that a while ago. And so it has its own powerful central banker. And he is very much coming under the eye of the fire of Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister of Poland's government, because he wants to perhaps use this spike in prices to purge elements of the previous government, the Law and Justice Party's remnants in some of the institutions in Poland, and price rises on things like butter is giving you an opportunity to do that. So butter is becoming increasingly politicised as a hot political potato ahead of the presidential elections in Poland that'll be happening in May of next year.
I shall neatly skip what you've just said there. But the interesting thing is that idea that if you do have political expediency here, butter is an incredibly simple way of going about things, because although it is, as the FT reports, only 0.6 of the average Polish consumer's spending, the fact is it's a very simple and accessible and relevant product that most Poles will encounter every single week. And it's just a very, very clever political move, isn't it?
It's very emotive. This is the Polish equivalent, I suppose, of the how much does a pint of milk cost, David Cameron, question that British politicians get asked all the time. And very often they can't remember how much a pint of milk costs or a loaf of bread. And that ends up being their undoing, because it comes across as though they're not in touch with your average person. I've covered other elections from afar that have been decided upon, say, in India. The price of onions is often an important backdrop to political change over there. So foodstuffs, emotive, and also a very convenient way of greasing the wheels of change, if you like, and in political circles.
And a sign of sort of readiness as well. I think we remember when COVID struck, countries looked to their own resources and their own stocks to see if they were able to actually sort of sustain a nation. Will Poland suffer a little bit of a backlash here, given the fact that if they are selling off something which is absolutely a day-to-day staple, that people will say, well, what happens if things go wrong again.
Well, there are other foodstuffs, of course, aren't they? But this is important because obviously Poland, Ukraine, these are the traditional sort of bread baskets of Eastern Europe, aren't they? And we've seen, even here in the United Kingdom, inflation figures have come out just this very morning, Emma, and they've showed that inflation is back on the rise. Across the Eurozone, the rise of the right political parties in the right that are challenging the centre-right in Europe, of which Donald Tusk himself, the Polish Prime Minister, is a member of that grouping. A lot of that comes from concerns about security over borders, security over crime and justice on the streets, security over food and resources. So that's one of the reasons why they're tapping into this subject.
Talking about tapping into something, let's move on to a story in the Times, which is Elon Musk, the world's richest man, giving serious thought to reform donation, says Nigel Farage. For those of us who've not encountered Nigel Farage, he's the sort of the character who cannot be defeated in British politics. Sort of far-right, sort of populist, not necessarily a firebrand, but has that ability to make very difficult subjects very accessible to an angry nation, and now seems to be having dinner with Elon Musk at Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah, that's right. So a few weeks ago, Westminster went all frothy over this suggestion by Elon Musk. You see, I haven't had my cappuccino yet. I'm getting very emotive about these suggestions of foodstuffs and analogies, Emma.
You must be hungry this morning.
Nigel Farage obviously, as you said, is the leader of this sort of Trumpist Reform Party that previously was very exercised over the subject of Brexit. He campaigned very heavily from actually inside Brussels that the UK needed to be independent from the EU. Donald Trump obviously views him as a political winner from that point of view, somebody who's very effectively managed to effect change from outside. Now he's inside Westminster because Nigel Farage and some of his Reform Party members have seats inside the venerable Parliament. And Elon Musk wants to try and see if he can repeat his political magic, where he threw a huge amount of money behind Donald Trump's campaign in key swing states in the election in November. He wants to see whether he could replicate that type of success in the UK to parachute reform from this sort of tiny little party that's managed to get a foothold in Parliament finally to challenge the big balance of power between the Conservative Party and the now ruling Labour Party. And what's really concerned people is that you've now you've seen Elon Musk say that he may or may not donate $100 million, which is life-changing political money in the UK. You've got to remember that political persuasion can be bought with a few £1,000s, really, or a couple of £100,000 in this country. $100 million would really change things radically.
And the fact that this is not 100,000 or 100, however many millions this is, in British money. This is international funding that could be coming into British politics. Labour, the current government, finding itself massively on the back foot here, saying it's considering tightening the rules, saying we're considering changes that will help protect our system from foreign interference, such as tighter controls on donations. This now becomes a major race against time to stop international interference and stop huge amounts of international money flooding the political world in the UK.
It does. This is the real concern here. So I was interviewing for a podcast I do on democracy, the Labour member of Parliament who's at the forefront of sort of anti-corruption initiatives, who said essentially that our regulatory bodies, i.e. the Electoral Commission, just are not well enough placed and are really behind the curve on this issue. As you said before, it's a race against time to see whether or not Elon Musk will either make this donation because he's stepped back from these suggestions that he might donate a huge amount of money. In the last couple of weeks, he said, no, I'm not planning on donating this money to reform. Technically, as per the laws in this country, he personally, by virtue of being a foreign citizen, can't technically donate to a political party here, but he does have companies that have footprints here, so they could potentially be used to donate to reform. Now, what has reinvigorated this debate is that Reform suddenly now have a new chairman, a new treasurer who's responsible for raising money in the form of this very glamorous multi-millionaire, perhaps even billionaire property developer, Nick Candy. And he has been out to Mar-a-Lago with Nigel Farage to meet Elon Musk. They didn't meet with Donald Trump himself, but this picture has emerged from yesterday of the three of them, Musk, Candy and Farage, standing in front of a portrait of Donald Trump, more or less saying, hey, look, perhaps the deal might be back on after all. And that has really concerned, as you said, the powers that be, not just in the Labour government, but also in the Conservative government, the fear they could get a reverse takeover from reform in the future.
Let's turn to books, given the fact that it is a week before Christmas. And so the media is trying to chase, the media is trying to chase social media now in terms of catching up with what is fashionable and what is on trend. And it is, if you don't have time to trawl TikTok all day, you can just read The Guardian. And The Guardian has this great story about how a small piece of literature, as if that is possible, by Dostoevsky, has suddenly become the go-to read. I think there's a Donna Tartt book a couple of years ago that everyone went bananas for. But this is a small piece of sort of 19th century Russian literature. And everyone's gone bananas.
Yeah, that's right. All these young people are following accounts and a phenomenon called book talk, if you like. So this is a book club on TikTok. And what it's done is revive the fortunes of Fyodor Dostoevsky, but not your traditional tomes that we might have read, like Crime and Punishment or The Brothers Karamazov. Instead, no, it's a tiny little book, a novella that's only 80 pages long called White Nights. And apparently this has been flying off the shelves, particularly the latest Penguin 2024 edition that has sort of got this beautiful black minimalist cover. They can't print enough of it. But I suppose if you look at the themes of this particular book, it speaks to themes of our times on social media. It's sort of this introverted guy who meets this woman on the streets of St. Petersburg, but she might be in love with somebody else, and then they sort of have this relationship in their mind in a distance. And so, yeah, Dostoevsky must have been ahead of his time before social media in terms of where, relationships online are going.
The Guardian is very good at this.
To that.
Yeah, it does say, it says, perhaps it should come as no surprise that a story about someone who's built an elaborate life of fantasy should become popular on social media, where users intentionally romanticize their lives. Who would have thought that a heartbroken Russian would be the one to do that?
Indeed.
Nina Dos Santos, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. The time here in London is just nudging 7:32 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. And look now at the other news stories we're keeping an eye on today. The US State Department has expressed optimism at the chances of a ceasefire and hostage deal between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. A proposal is being discussed between the two sides. All previous attempts at a deal have collapsed. China's President Xi Jinping arrives in Macau today to mark a quarter century of Beijing's rule over the former Portuguese territory. Xi's trip to the world's biggest gambling hub is his third as president, during which he'll attend the inauguration of the territory's new chief executive. And Luigi Mangione, the man suspected of shooting the healthcare boss Brian Thompson in New York, has been indicted for murder. He also faces one charge related to terror. The Manhattan District Attorney said the killing was intended to cause shock and intimidation. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. 7:33 a.m. here in London, 8:33 in Paris. Now, for 8 decades, the French newspaper Le Monde has served as a leading voice not only for all things French, but also when it comes to world affairs. The national institution is 80 years old today, and it's meeting its future head-on in a bid to attract fresh readers and hit a milestone of 1 million subscribers by next year. The paper's launched a new biannual English language version of its M, Le Magazine du Monde print title. Well, Le Monde Group CEO Louis Dreyfus spoke to our editorial director and chairman Tyler Brûlé and our editor-in-chief Andrew Tuck at Monocle's Paris Media Summit recently, and they began by asking him how, in its 80th anniversary year, things have shaped up for Le Monde.
The first thing that you have to know, it's true for Le Monde and it's true for many quality media, the worse the news are, the better it is for our economy, because people, when there is news that are so complex and so violent, people go back to the quality media to try to understand what's going on. So over the past year, we have seen our paid circulation growing much more than what we thought. There was the election in the US, obviously conflict in the Middle East, and also exceptional election at the French Parliament. So we have had a circulation growing. But the other thing that we saw, and it's true since COVID years, that people want to read something more about their personal life, about the intimacy, which is quite new for Le Monde. So we created those topics and spaces in the daily, in the magazine, on the website. And now, quite often, the stories that are most read, most shared, or that attract more new subscribers are not the one on politics or international news, but the one on intimacy and personal news. Because when the world reached this level of violence, people want to have access to peaceful piece of content. And in this way, what we are doing with Le Magazine du Monde is quite a success in trying to build a safe environment for readers.
Can I ask you the commercial side of that question? You know, there is so many conflicts in the world and so many difficult things happening, and it's making some people very cautious about what 2025 will look like. What's your view as you look over the horizon to 2025 for what it will mean for the commercial partners you have as well? Are you seeing some nervousness, or do you think that people are going to be a little bit more confident as the year begins?
We saw two things on the French market when the French president decided, surprisingly enough, to call for a new election. There was a complete stop in advertising because nobody understood what was going on. They wanted to have some security on what was the next step, so it stopped. Then we saw on the luxury good market, but I'm sure everybody here knows that the difficulty on the Chinese market changed the pace of development in this market in advertising. But for the strong brand, if you are able to explain what is your audience and what is your identity, I think we are still able to get advertisers to follow us. And we have different projects for the year to come, and the contact we have had with advertisers were positive. So if you can give them a prospect in terms of development of new audiences, then you can get a contract. So we are quite optimistic, and I'm sure that in a few months after this slowdown, March or April, it will go back as before.
Maybe let's just take a step back. When you talked about launching these new series, these new initiatives, is this because your editors and your journalists have a proximity to the market and the audience? Is it driven by, let's say, more classical research that you sort of take these kind of ventures? What's been driving that?
It's not by research. It's the belief that we have at Le Monde to be a leader in French journalism. You must have always few meters in advance from your competitors. Even though we are the largest newspaper in France for 5 to 6 years, even though we are still growing, we want to reach a new audience. The main challenge is how can we make sure that the under 20 years old will read Le Monde for the next 30 to 40 years. So we're investing a lot in this younger audience on digital networks, on Snapchat, YouTube, and TikTok, but with digital product. And whenever we have a project, there must be an editorial project at the core of this development. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it because all of our DNA is centered on the editorial staff. So if there is a project, that means that is at the beginning, there is a journalist who wants to lead this project. And then our advertising team and marketing team are trying to see if there is a market. But at the beginning, there is an editorial point of view.
Most people in the room know that you're moving to English language. Of course, there's already an English language edition of Le Monde online newsletter, but also taking English. I'm sure this is going to be wildly successful in terms of advertising. Does this help shore up the revenues that you might hope to be getting from this future generation? Or is doing Le Monde global more of a brand play?
It's both, actually. 2 years ago, we started with a digital edition in English of Le Monde. Thanks to artificial intelligence, we were able to invest in translating 70% of our daily content to have Le Monde in English. For the one who are subscribing to Le Monde, if you go to the app, you can see that you can switch to the English edition. You will have the same experience, but you can reach a wider audience. The bet was We know that the American market has a tremendous number of digital subscribers for news. If we can get a small chunk of them to subscribe to Le Monde edition, it will be very successful for us. So we launch Le Monde in English, and we see that every time there is intense news, election in France, election in the US, we see this number of subscribers in English growing. For M, it was a mix of this success plus strategy of building core brand with M, thanks to Marie-Pierre Lannelongue. She launched this magazine, she launched the digital venture, she launched events. The next step was to grow internationally. We'll launch in March an international edition in English, made with the content she produced for M, or for Le Goût de M, who is quarterly published in French, and we'll do, for the first year, twice a year. And I'm sure that in the most part of Asia and the Western world, we will have a success in newsstand and obviously for advertisers. But it's an audience that you know that Tyler much more than I do, but I'm sure there is a market for both of us.
And that was Le Monde Group CEO Louis Dreyfus in conversation with Monocle's Tyler Brûlé and Andrew Tuck. You're listening to Monocle Radio. Now, it's been nearly a year since the three nations of Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger said they were leaving the West African regional bloc of Ecowas. The reasons given by the countries, who've all gone through military coups and jihadist insurgencies in recent years, was that Ecowas had imposed, and I quote, inhumane and irresponsible sanctions and was subservient to a former colonial ruler of France. Well, all three nations are due to leave by the end of January. This week, Ecowas approved their departure, albeit with the option of a change of mind. So to tell us more, I'm joined by Tara O'Connor, who's Managing Director of Africa Risk Consulting, a pan-African risk management firm. Very good morning to you, Tara.
Good morning.
So just lay out the timetable of all this, but from the point that the three nations, Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger, said we are going, to where we are now and what happens next.
So, well, it's a year now since, I think in January this year, the three countries said that they were going to leave as they formed their own federation. So they are now part of the Alliance of the Alliance of Sahelian States, which has its own structure that is a similar federation type structure. And so a year on, they are very determined. The Burkina Faso's special advisor to the junta leader, Traoré, said that their decision is irreversible and that there's nothing that ECOWAS can do or say now that will allow them to change their minds. But the flexibility has come on the part of ECOWAS, which had a meeting to actually discuss on the 15th of December, had a meeting to discuss what this would look like. And they've allowed for a grace period of 6 months for this to occur, with the objective of trying to persuade the countries to change their minds.
And this leaving the door open, what chances of success are there?
Well, it's very difficult to say. These three countries have become very, become very bound with each other in the face of a growing insurgency. If you remember, one of the things that the AES has done was to get rid of force all of the Western troops that were supporting its anti-insurgency measures to leave the region. And that was something like between 20 and 30,000 Western troops, Western-backed troops left, which opened the door to far greater insurgency from Islamist extremist groups and from Tuareg separatist movements that have really caused extreme insecurity in the region.
And building on that, where does this leave the reputation of ECOWAS? Because these gestures that it is, or these moves that it is making, and also the fact that it has led calls from the international community for these three nations to return to democracy, to abandon the military juntas that are in charge. They have pretty much fallen on deaf ears, haven't they? And this is always raising that bigger question of how supernatural bodies have, well, the degree of influence that they may or may not have.
Well, I think, ECOWAS got off to a very bad start in this because it immediately imposed sanctions and it threatened to use its powers that it has actually as part of its structure to intervene, to reverse the military coups, which put the three countries very much on the defensive. And a defense, the AES structure comprises a defense pact. But when I think that, but the ECOWAS has actually stepped back from that. And they've appointed the Senegalese president, the new, very dynamic Bassirou Faye, as the mediator. And he seems to be making progress. He himself has also asked French troops to leave Senegal. He's very much aligned with the sort of neo-nationalist kind of view that the AES leaders take. And so he's been making progress. To continue, if there is a continued belligerence between the parties, obviously the impact is quite, the withdrawal will have a significant impact on future trade. I mean, the best example we can say is the impact that Brexit has had, for example, on the UK in diminishing the economy. The three countries comprise something like 8% of the GDP of the region. And it means that things like free movement of people within that region will go, and a lot of free trade arrangements that ECOWAS is bound upon will fall away, which is obviously negative for these three countries, which are also large landlocked countries.
Tara O'Connor, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. You were The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
15:47 in Taipei, 7:47 a.m. here in London. Now, Taiwan has taken delivery of the first batch of battle tanks supplied by the United States. They were ordered in 2019 with a final consignment expected to arrive in 2026. Well, let's cross over to Taipei now, from where the journalist William Yang joins me. A very good afternoon to you, William.
Thank you for having me again.
So just explain which tanks we're talking about. Plus, there are extra missiles and armoured recovery vehicles on the way as well, aren't they? What's in this order?
Right. So in this order is the 38 Advanced Abraham battle tanks that have, like you said, been ordered in 2019, and it's been slowly delivered to Taiwan. And this is the first time that these kind of new tanks have been delivered to Taiwan in 30 years. And analysts and experts are saying that these tanks will be able to help to form very important defense capabilities in the northern part of Taiwan, especially around some of the beaches that are considered as vulnerable to potential amphibious landing by a potential invading Chinese troops. And despite the fact that Taiwan has been highlighting the importance of switching over to using more mobile, smaller types of weapons in recent years due to the inspiration from the Ukraine war, experts are saying that these tanks will play a very important role in diminishing the incoming invading Chinese troops in the event of a war across the Taiwan Strait.
The original order was made a good 5 years ago. I mean, how much more acute is Taiwan's need for these tanks?
I think as the Chinese military's capabilities continue to increase, and at the same time this year, we are seeing an increase of their frequency of conducting military exercise around Taiwan and also on the beaches along the Chinese coast. This is in fact coming at a very critical time. And also, like you said, the speed of the delivery of these weapons, which have been highlighted by the Taiwanese side as being slowed and also stalled by domestic political infighting within the United States, or just the stalling by the legislative process over there. So because of that, and also the fact that Ukraine has taken a lot of the priorities for a lot of the weapons delivery, that has caused a delay in the Taiwanese weapons delivery. So for Taiwan to be receiving an order from 5 years ago just now, that I think shows that there is a need for Taipei to continue to push or at least voice its concern to Washington, and so that maybe the delivery will be more timely in the future.
The background to all this goes back how far? Because I mean, if we look at I think in the Taiwan Relations Act, which goes back a good nearly 50 years, it talks about the United States' commitment to Taiwan, that it will provide it with arms of a defensive character. I mean, is this part of the wider, very, very difficult relationship in terms of what kind of relationship the United States has with Taiwan?
Right, exactly. Like you said, the U.S. is basically the largest arms supporter, probably the only one that continues to sell billions of dollars of weapons to Taiwan over the years. And we have seen since 2016 that the U.S. government has been increasing the frequency of these weapons delivery and also approving arms sales. But with the incoming Trump administration that will take office on January 20th next month, there is a little bit of an uncertainty about how his administration might view this weapons delivery to Taiwan, because he has been very vague about the commitment to potentially commit the U.S. military to the defense of Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion. And at the same time, he kept talking about this idea that Taiwan should be paying for the U.S. for the protection. So there is some potential underlying concern now circulating around Taiwan regarding whether his return to the White House will mean a change or a recalibration from Washington's side when it comes to its policy towards Taiwan. And obviously, this arms sales and also the weapons delivery to Taiwan will be one of the most critical areas that Taipei will continue to pay very close attention to.
William Yang in Taipei, thank you so much for joining us on the line. You're listening to The Globalist live on Monocle Radio. Finally, it's time for the latest news on all things mobility and transit. Gabriel Lee is Monocle's transport correspondent and joins you on the line from Stockholm. A very good morning to you, Gabriel. How's Stockholm looking today?
Good morning. It's a little bit dark and dim this morning, in the December fashion, but it's okay.
Okay. That sounds quite reassuring, actually. You have just had an amazing trip to Antarctica, haven't you? Tell us where you've been.
Yeah, I took a flight, and actually a series of flights within Antarctica, but basically there's an operator called White Desert out of Cape Town that sends these wide-body jets down to a private ice runway in Antarctica and does these week-long trips. You can also do day trips. They're quite expensive, but they're incredible. And you fly around Antarctica a little bit too. You can visit the South Pole. I didn't get to do that this time, but this is the sort of short summer season down there where you can go. And it was really incredible. So, sort of an incredible feat of logistics as well, just to sort of operate all of this, to get a jet down there, to turn it around, to fill it with passengers, bring down all the fresh food and linens. They can't do laundry down there, for example. Lots of really fascinating aspects to it from an aviation standpoint, but of course also Antarctica, just amazing, the most remote and incredible place I've been.
It is quite mind-blowing when you just see the pictures, the sort of publicity pictures on White Desert's website, when they have people literally, shots of penguins and then people drinking champagne on the ice. But this idea of being able to fly a wide-bodied commercial passenger jet to Antarctica, I mean, talk us through how they do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the interesting thing is that they sort of spent a lot of time on, well, first they found the site, right, on this sort of very flat ice sheet in the sort of ideal location, and then they set out this 3,000-meter long runway, which they spend 22 hours beforehand grooming and grading it, right? So they kind of like equipment that you would have on a mountain for ski runs, and they make sure that there's enough friction there for a big jet to land. So actually, it's similar to the kind of, a bad weather day at a regular airport, like landing at Heathrow, in terms of how the pilots consider the friction on the runway. But there are other considerations too. Of course, you can't do much once you get down there. If something goes wrong, the weather has to be just right when they set out. They're prepared to turn back around to Cape Town at the last minute, which happens sometimes because the weather changes quite quickly as well. So you do need a lot of special training and lots of considerations go into operating that flight, but they managed to do it safely, and it's really incredible, actually.
Not to mention the issue of de-icing the plane.
Yeah, well, luckily down there you don't have much need for de-icing because that would be an issue to de-ice a wide body down there. Luckily, because of the way it is, the weather down there, it's basically a desert, right? And if there were going to be any kind of icing conditions en route or at the airfield, they just wouldn't go. So they plan to not have to do that, basically. Mostly it's dry and sunny, and if a storm has kicked up, they're not flying anyway.
Let's move on to Ukraine. It is going to establish a Europe-based aviation network, or its SkyUp airline, is going to start up, but from Moldova. That's right, yeah. So SkyUp is a charter and low-cost airline from Ukraine. Obviously, at the moment, there's no commercial flying in Ukraine whatsoever. It just doesn't work. So it looks like they've found a way to sort of pick back up their operation. It's a pretty recent startup, actually. They started just back in 2018. They didn't have long to fly before they had to stop. So now they've decided to sort of operate out of a new base in Moldova. So at least, they can provide some kind of connectivity, act as an airline once again. So kind of interesting, innovative approach. I hope it goes well for them. And there's interesting sort of logistics here insofar as it has to fly from Moldova, but that sort of acts as a replacement for the Moldovan flag carrier Air Moldova, which collapsed last year. So this is Ukraine, this is SkyUp very cleverly spotting a gap in a market in a geographical location that suits as well. Right, yeah, it's really sort of using their various constraints, and like you say, seeing this potential. There's now a need. There's a demand that's not being filled out of Moldova's capital. So it's quite smart that they're and you kind of admire that they're looking at ways to make it work, despite the fact that it would seem impossible to operate a Ukrainian airline at the moment. Let's talk about the former Equatorial Congo Airlines, EC Air. They are flogging off a whole cabin. Tell us more about that, please, Gabriel. That's right. They had an aircraft that was sitting in Brussels for, I think, about 8 years now. They ran into bankruptcy, various financial problems. This is something you see at airports around the world periodically. You see there's an aircraft that just the airline runs out of money and the plane just sits there for years. In this case, they're approaching that again with a kind of innovative solution. Instead of letting it just rot in the weather over decades, it was bought out by a Belgian company. And part of this is this project. After they bought it out, they did various things with the aircraft, dismantled it, but they've saved a section of the fuselage and cabin to auction it off. So if you want a portion of a Boeing 757 on your property, you can now buy it. There's an auction site that's selling it off, which if I had the space, I would consider it, actually. Well, exactly. It requires a bit of a long back garden. Yes, you would need quite a bit of land, and I guess they would truck it over from Belgium. So it's presumably quite costly and difficult to manage. But if you had the space in the garden, yeah, it could be quite an unusual thing, You get everything, including the seats and the overhead cabins and the lot. Yeah, you even get the overhead bins. So it's pretty cool, actually. A very, very rare thing to be able to buy. Gabriel Lee, thank you so much for joining us, as ever, on The Globalist. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producers Hassan Anderson and Carlos Rebello. Our researcher was Maisie Ringer and our studio manager was Flynn Simons. After the headlines, more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. I hope you can join me for that if you can. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.